This may be the most powerful new rule at the World Cup, and almost nobody is talking about it the right way. Because FIFA has now given players a universal X gesture that can stop a match, suspend a match, and if the abuse does not stop, abandon the match completely. One crossed arm signal and the biggest game in the world can suddenly be on the edge of ending. That is not symbolism anymore. That is power. This may be the most powerful new rule at the World Cup, and somehow it is still being treated like a side note. Not a new offside system, not a time-wasting countdown, not another VAR tweak, not the red card crackdown for protest walk-offs. No. The rule that may actually carry the biggest emotional weight is a gesture, a simple crossed arms X, and FIFA has attached something enormous to it, because this is no longer just an anti-racism campaign image or a symbolic pose for pre-match photos. It is now part of match protocol. If a player is racially abused, that player can make the X gesture directly to the referee, and that can trigger a chain reaction that leads to the game being stopped, suspended, or abandoned altogether. And that is why this changes everything, because football has spent years pretending it was serious about racism, while often leaving players stranded in the middle of it. Abuse happens, matches continue, maybe there is an announcement, maybe there is an investigation later, maybe there is a fine, maybe there is a strongly worded statement that disappears into the usual fog of football bureaucracy. But what FIFA has now done is different. They have taken the abstract promise of anti-racism and attached it to something immediate, visible, and universally understandable on the pitch. Cross your wrists, make the X, and the game itself can no longer just pretend nothing happened. That is the real story here, not just the gesture, the power behind it, because FIFA did not introduce this as decoration. Back in May 2024, Reuters reported that FIFA proposed mandatory racism sanctions across all 211 member associations, including match forfeits. In the same package, FIFA said it would pause, suspend, and abandon games in cases of racism, while introducing a global standard gesture for players to communicate racist incidents and for referees to signal the implementation of the three-step procedure. Reuters explained that the gesture involves players raising their hands and crossing their wrists, so the referee is made aware of a racist incident. That is not a vague commitment. That is a mechanism. And once you have a mechanism, football changes, because now there is a language for intervention, a visible one, a broadcast one, a global one, a language that does not need translation. That is what makes the X gesture so important. It is football taking a problem that used to be buried in noise, confusion, or denial, and giving it a signal that cameras can catch instantly. No one can say afterward that they did not know what was being reported. No one can pretend the player was just emotional or misunderstood or gesturing randomly. FIFA has created an official sign that says, this is racism, this is serious, and this match may now be in danger. And the protocol behind it is what gives the rule real force. FIFA's own language is blunt. First, the match is stopped. If the abuse continues, the match is suspended, with players and officials leaving the field. And if it still does not stop, the match is abandoned. Reuters called it a three-step procedure. FIFA's official release said the same thing when the gesture was formally introduced at the Under-20 Women's World Cup in 2024, after unanimous approval at the FIFA Congress. In FIFA's words, players, referees, and team officials are being empowered to take a stand against racism as part of a zero-tolerance framework. Now think about what that means at a World Cup. Not a youth-friendly, not a third-tier league game, not a closed-door disciplinary experiment. The World Cup, a match with millions watching, billions potentially over the life of the tournament. National teams, national flags, national pressure, and now one player in one moment can raise crossed wrists and force the biggest spectacle in football into a moral test it cannot dodge. That is why the dramatic title works, even if not literally, because in the wrong moment, or maybe the right moment depending on how you see it, the World Cup really can feel like it has just ended. Not the tournament, obviously, but the illusion that football can always keep rolling through anything. That illusion is exactly what this rule attacks, and FIFA clearly wants us to understand that this is not just performative. On the International Day for Countering Hate Speech during the 2026 World Cup, FIFA publicly leaned into the campaign. It said hate speech has no place in football or society, and described the no racism gesture as a tool to empower players, coaches, and match officials. FIFA also said its social media protection service had removed more than 30 million abusive posts and comments in more than 50 languages since 2022, and that the 2026 World Cup was expected to see more than 5 times as many abusive posts and comments removed compared with the 2022 tournament. In 1 week of the 2026 World Cup alone, FIFA said more than 530,000 toxic messages had already been removed. That matters because it shows the scale of the problem FIFA says it is responding to. This is not framed as a marginal issue. FIFA is telling you in its own numbers that abuse around the modern game is industrial in scale. Millions of comments, hundreds of thousands of toxic messages. A system that now has to defend players and officials not just in the stadium but online in real time across languages and borders. So when they introduce a gesture that can stop a World Cup match, they are not doing that in a vacuum. They are reacting to an environment they themselves describe as flooded with hate. And that is where this story becomes bigger than football law, because once you create an official gesture that can suspend a World Cup match, you are no longer just regulating sport. You are changing the politics of the spectacle. Before this, a racist incident could still get trapped in argument. Did the player hear correctly? Did the referee understand? Was it a fan, another player, staff? What exactly was said? Could it be proven? Would the game continue while everyone argued? The X gesture is FIFA's attempt to cut straight through that chaos. It does not answer every question, but it changes the order of importance. The priority is no longer keep the match moving until the paperwork is done later. The priority becomes take the signal seriously now. That is the phrase to focus on, seriously now, because football has often looked like a sport that wants to deal with racism after the emotional moment is past, after the cameras move on, after the crowd goes home, after statements are drafted, but the X gesture drags the issue into the live event itself. It forces the match to absorb the problem in front of everyone. It says the abuse is not a side story. It is now part of the game's operational reality. And you can see how sensitive all of this has already become from the gesture controversies around the tournament. The Associated Press reported on a World Cup incident involving support VAR official Sean Evans, who made a hand sign on camera that resembled a white supremacist symbol. Evans said it was an involuntary twitch, and FIFA's disciplinary committee concluded there was no breach of the code. But the reaction was immediate because symbols now matter intensely in this World Cup environment. AP noted that FIFA had directed players to use the crossed forearms X gesture to alert match officials to racist abuse. In other words, the tournament has become so symbol-conscious that even the shape of an official's hand on camera can become an international incident. And that tells you something important. The X gesture is not living in a calm environment. It is living in a world where football's optics around racism are under a microscope. That makes this new rule even more explosive, because the moment a player uses the X in a truly major game, the entire conversation around the match changes instantly. The referee is no longer just managing tactics and fouls. The broadcasters are no longer just narrating the action. The tournament itself is being tested in public, and that is why this rule changes everything even if it is used only once. Because some rules matter every minute. Others matter only in crisis. This is a crisis rule, a rule designed for the moment football's normal script fails, a rule designed for the moment a player says, enough, a rule designed for the moment the match cannot just continue as if dignity is optional. That is why it carries so much weight. You do not measure it by how often it appears. You measure it by what happens when it does. Now, supporters of the rule will say this is exactly what football needed, and honestly, they have a very strong case. For too long, the burden has sat on players to endure abuse and keep performing. For too long, football has treated racist incidents like unfortunate interruptions to the entertainment rather than violations that should break the entertainment itself. The X gesture flips that. It gives the player a direct tool. It gives the referee a direct response path. It gives the system no easy excuse to keep pretending that the match is more important than the abuse happening inside it. Reuters. But critics will raise a different set of fears, and they are worth taking seriously too. Because once you create a mechanism powerful enough to stop or abandon a World Cup match, people will immediately worry about consistency, evidence, pressure, and misuse. What happens if the referee hesitates? What happens if one official reacts immediately and another delays? What happens if the crowd is the source? What happens if the incident is player to player and disputed? What happens if a knockout match is hanging in the balance? What happens if broadcasters, federations, and tournament officials all feel the commercial shockwave of a possible suspension? These are not trivial questions. A rule this powerful does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a sport that has often struggled to apply even ordinary disciplinary standards consistently across big teams, small teams, stars, and pressure moments. That is exactly why people will watch the first major use of this gesture so closely, not just to see whether FIFA means it, but to see whether FIFA means it equally. FIFA and consistency is everything here. Because if the X gesture is celebrated in press releases but underused in practice, people will smell performative politics instantly. If it is used for some incidents but not others, the backlash will be huge. If it works cleanly one day and collapses into confusion the next, the critics will say football once again found the perfect moral language and then failed to back it with consistent courage. That is why the next step after introducing the gesture is actually more important than the gesture itself. Enforcement, resolve, follow through, because football has never been short of slogans. Say no to racism. Kick it out. Stand against hate. The game can manufacture beautiful words all day. What it has been short of at times is a live mechanism that forces everybody in the chain to choose between spectacle and principle. The X gesture is that mechanism, and once it is used, there is nowhere to hide, and maybe that is the most uncomfortable part for football authorities, broadcasters, and fans alike, because everyone says they want zero tolerance until zero tolerance threatens the match they wanted to watch. Everyone says the game must act until acting means stopping the game. That is the real test built into this rule, not whether people applaud the idea of it, whether they still support it when the clock is frozen, the players are walking off, and the biggest event in world football is suddenly no longer about football. That is why the title works. The World Cup just ended is not literally true for the whole tournament, but for any one match, under the right circumstances, it could become emotionally true in seconds. Because once the X goes up, the game changes, the mood changes, the pressure changes, the stakes change, and everyone in the stadium understands that football has just crossed from competition into confrontation with something bigger than the result. That is what makes this rule historic. Not that it exists, that it can interrupt the biggest show on earth. And make no mistake, FIFA wants that possibility to be visible. The official description of the no racism gesture says it is designed to empower players, team officials, and referees to take a stand. The whole point is to move from passive messaging to active intervention. If a player is targeted by racist abuse, the signal is there. The process is there. The authority is there. In theory, the excuses are gone. So now the question is not whether the X gesture is real. It is real. Not whether it is official, it is official. Not whether it can lead to a match being suspended or abandoned, it can. The real question is whether football will actually use this power when the moment comes. Because if it does, this will be remembered as the point where the sport finally decided that anti-racism was not just branding. It was match control. It was law. It was consequence. And if it doesn't, the gesture risks becoming one more image the game loves when it is symbolic and fears when it is costly. That is why FIFA's new X gesture rule changes everything, because the old football answer to racism was often, keep going, sort it out later. The new answer, at least on paper, is stop the match, suspend it, and if necessary, end it. And once the world knows that, every racist incident now carries a different kind of gravity. It is no longer just disgraceful, it is disruptive, it is no longer just shameful, it is operational, it no longer threatens only the victim, it threatens the match itself. That is power, that is pressure, and that is why this may be the most important World Cup rule that most people still have not fully understood. So what do you think? Is this the moment football finally got serious about racism? Or is the real test still coming? The first time a truly massive World Cup match has to be stopped because someone made the X. Drop your take below. If you want World Cup coverage that tracks not just the goals, but the rules and power struggles changing the game, subscribe.